a doctor, a billionaire, and a 9-year-old girl caught in a twisted game of power and revenge. When a renowned physician attacks a young girl in the most brutal way imaginable, her father, a ruthless billionaire, will stop at nothing to get justice. But what happens when the tables turn and the real puppet masters reveal themselves? Secrets, betrayal, and mind-blowing twists await in this gripping tale. Will a father's thirst for revenge destroy everything, or will he uncover a conspiracy far darker than he could have ever imagined? Subscribe now. Don't miss this shocking story of revenge and redemption. Ariana lay on the examination table, her small hands clutching the edge tightly. Dr. Hayes' smile didn't comfort her. It felt wrong, like it was masking something dark. She flinched slightly as his hands moved to her arm to check her pulse, his grip lingering a little too long. "Relax, Ariana," he said softly, his tone almost too sweet. "I'm just making sure everything is fine." She nodded hesitantly, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. She told herself this was just part of a regular checkup. But then his hands started wandering, down her arms, across her chest, then lower. Ariana's body stiffened. "Doctor, I think that's enough," she stammered, her voice trembling. He ignored her, his voice soft and patronizing. "It's okay, sweetheart. I need to check for any unusual growths. Just stay still." His hand slipped beneath her shirt, touching her bare skin. A chill ran down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she felt frozen in place, too shocked and confused to move. "No! Stop!" Ariana cried out, her voice breaking. Dr. Hayes' face changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "Quiet!" he hissed, gripping her wrist tightly when she tried to push his hand away. "You'll make this worse for yourself if you don't cooperate." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whimpered, "I want my dad. Please let me go." "You don't need your dad right now," he said sharply, his mask of kindness slipping further. "You just need to trust me." At that moment, the door creaked open, and Nurse Maria appeared. Her sharp intake of breath was all Ariana needed to bolt off the table, clutching her shirt as she fled the room. Ariana's chest heaved with frantic breaths as she buried her face in her father's chest. The world around her felt like it was collapsing. She hadn't realized until now how much fear had paralyzed her during that exam. Fear of the unknown, of the quiet way Dr. Hayes had cornered her. It wasn't until she was free that the weight of what had happened truly hit her. Malcolm stood frozen for a moment, his arms wrapped around his daughter as he tried to process what she had just said. "He hurt you?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't even say the words out loud. Ariana nodded, unable to speak anymore, as the sobs racked her tiny body. The look in her eyes, the fear, the confusion, was all Malcolm needed to understand. Rage began to bubble up inside him, scorching through his veins like fire. A father's protective instinct was a primal force, and in that moment, he felt it in its purest, most terrifying form. "Sweetheart, you're safe now," he murmured, holding her even tighter, but his mind was already racing. He couldn't just let this go. He wouldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. He glanced around the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw the staff members watching from the edges of the lobby. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. His gaze hardened. "Where is Dr. Hayes?" Malcolm's voice was a low growl, full of venom. The receptionist, a young woman who had been too busy with her phone to notice what had happened until now, glanced nervously up at him. He's in the back, but sir, perhaps we should—" "Where?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising with authority. The woman flinched, and after a brief hesitation, she pointed down the hallway. "He's in his office, sir." Without another word, Malcolm gently pushed Ariana into the arms of a nurse who had rushed over. "Stay with her," he ordered, his tone cold and deadly serious. His eyes locked on the receptionist, who nodded quickly, not daring to defy him. He stormed down the hallway, his footsteps echoing like thunder. The sound of his own heart thumped loudly in his ears. All he could think about was his daughter. How she had been violated by someone who was supposed to be trusted, someone who had sworn an oath to protect children. The idea of it made his blood boil. When he reached Dr. Hayes' office, he didn't bother to knock. He ripped the door open with a force that made it slam against the wall. Dr. Hayes, sitting at his desk, looked up in surprise, the friendly mask slipping for just a moment. "Mr. Kingston, I wasn't expecting you," Dr. Hayes said smoothly, his voice dripping with fake civility. "Is something wrong with Ariana?" "You're damn right something's wrong," Malcolm snarled, stepping into the office and shutting the door behind him. He took a step closer, towering over the doctor. "You touched my daughter. You hurt her." The doctor's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "I assure you, Mr. Kingston, nothing happened. Ariana is just a bit sensitive. These things happen in medicine." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. The sheer arrogance in Dr. Hayes' voice made his blood boil even more. "You don't get it, do you?" Malcolm's voice dropped to a whisper, dangerously low. "I can make your life hell in an instant. I don't care what networks you have, how much power you think you wield. You've hurt my daughter, I'll destroy you." Dr. Hayes' smile faltered for a second before he recovered, leaning forward with a predatory glint in his eyes. "You think you can take me down just like that? You're a businessman, Mr. Kingston. You're used to playing by the rules. But you're in my world now. And in my world, we protect our own." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Hayes' smirk widened, though it was dark and unsettling. "You don't know who you're dealing with. You think this is just some small, isolated incident. But it's bigger than you could ever imagine. I've been at this for years, and no one has ever managed to touch me." Malcolm leaned in closer, his voice deadly soft. "I'm going to ruin you. You'll never practice again. And if you so much as look at my daughter the wrong way again, I'll make sure the world knows what kind of monster you are." Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, eyeing Malcolm with cold, calculating eyes. "You can try, Mr. Kingston, but let me tell you this. Whatever you think you know, you don't. You're in way over your head." Malcolm turned to leave, his mind racing. The doctor's words sent a chill down his spine, but they also filled him with even more determination. This was bigger than just a sick doctor. This was about a corrupt system, one that was designed to protect people like him while ruining those who dared to challenge them. As he exited the office, Malcolm's mind was made up. He wasn't going to just take this to the police or the media. No, he was going to dismantle this empire, piece by piece. And it all started with Dr. Bradley Hayes. But little did he know, the web of corruption was much deeper than he realized. Dr. Hayes wasn't just a lone predator. He was a part of something far more dangerous. Malcolm's fury only grew as he returned to Ariana, but now he had a new fire burning within him: vengeance. The fight for his daughter's safety had just begun. Malcolm sat in his car, the engine idling in the parking lot of the clinic. The cold leather of the steering wheel beneath his fingers felt distant, like the rest of the world was far removed from the emotional hurricane that raged inside him. His daughter's face haunted him. Her terror, the way her tiny body had trembled in his arms, still felt like a sharp sting in his chest. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll make sure he never hurts you again," he whispered to himself, his voice cold, his words a vow. But as the seconds passed, that vow transformed. The reality was that simply confronting Dr. Hayes wasn't enough. The clinic was just a small part of a much bigger operation. He had to dig deeper. This wasn't going to be a simple case of one doctor crossing a line. No, Dr. Hayes was just a cog in a machine, an ugly, corrupt system that protected its own and buried its victims. Malcolm pulled out his phone, dialing the number of his longtime lawyer and friend, Tessa Hayes. She was sharp, resourceful, and, importantly, had the connections needed to uncover secrets buried deep in the medical and legal world. "Tessa," Malcolm said, his voice barely more than a growl, "I need your help. Something's wrong at the Kingston Clinic, and I need to know everything about Dr. Bradley Hayes." Tessa's voice came through the phone, calm but sharp. "What's going on? What happened?" "There's a lot I'm not sure about yet," he replied, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "But I'm telling you, it's bigger than just one bad doctor. I need you to dig into his background, his connections, and anyone who's ever worked with him. Something about this feels off." There was a long pause before Tessa spoke again, her voice now steely. "You want me to find out how deep this goes, right?" "Exactly. If Hayes is connected to anything shady, I want to know. No stone left unturned." "Got it. I'll get on it right away." "Thanks, Tessa." He hung up the phone, his mind already spinning with possible outcomes. As much as he wanted to lash out in the moment, Malcolm knew the first move had to be calculated. His wealth and connections gave him power, but the system he was up against was much more complex than a few phone calls could fix. Dr. Hayes's nonchalant attitude, the way he dismissed Malcolm's threats, only confirmed that there was something larger at play. Tessa called him back late that night, her voice grave. "Malcolm, I've dug into Dr. Hayes's past, and it's worse than you think." Malcolm's pulse quickened. "How bad?" "The man has a history, not just as a doctor, but as a powerful figure in a network of illegal activity that's been running for over a decade. It's not just medical malpractice. This is about patient exploitation, money laundering, and even trafficking. His ties go all the way up the chain. He's got connections in government, law enforcement, and within the medical community that ensure he's never touched." Malcolm's vision blurred for a moment. The anger was bubbling up again, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped his phone. "Wait! What are you saying?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You mean to tell me he's been doing this for years, and no one stopped him?" Tessa sighed, the weight of the situation settling between them. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Dr. Hayes isn't just some rogue doctor. He's part of a well-oiled machine, a network of power and corruption that protects people like him. If you're planning to go after him, you'll need more than just a good lawyer in your name, Malcolm. This is going to take resources, and it's going to get dangerous." Malcolm's mind raced. Dangerous. The word echoed in his thoughts like a warning bell. But the thought of what had happened to Ariana, of her shaking body and tear-streaked face, drove him to keep moving forward. He couldn't back down now, not after everything his daughter had been through. "I don't care how dangerous it is," Malcolm said, his voice cold and determined. "I will bring him down. I will burn his entire world to the ground. If you have connections in law enforcement, I need them now. If Hayes has been getting away with this for years, it's time someone exposed him." Tessa was silent for a moment, then gave a short, resigned sigh. "All right. I'll do what I can. But I'm warning you, this isn't just a fight against one man. This goes far deeper than that. And you might be stepping into something you can't control." Malcolm wasn't worried about control anymore. He didn't care how deep this went, or how big the fight would be. His only thought was to protect Ariana and make sure no one else would ever be hurt the way she had been. "Just get me what I need. I'll handle the rest," he said. And with that, he ended the call. The next day, Malcolm sat in the corner of his penthouse office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. His mind churned with Tessa's words. This wasn't just about a sick doctor. It was about a system that thrived on exploitation and corruption. But the more Malcolm thought about it, the more a realization gnawed at him. Dr. Hayes was just one piece of the puzzle, one that would fall quickly if he could get to the people who protected him. He'd need to gather leverage, evidence that could break the network wide open. The idea of going to the police or the press now felt naive. He'd seen firsthand how easily people like Hayes could manipulate the system. He would have to work outside the law. In his private office, he opened his laptop and began making calls to the most trusted investigators in his network. He didn't need to be subtle anymore. He wasn't asking for favors. He was demanding results. Malcolm Kingston had no intention of just exposing Dr. Hayes. He was going to destroy everything that protected him, and everyone else who had been part of the web of corruption. The sun had barely risen, but Malcolm was already at work. He had always been a man who thrived in the face of adversity, a businessman who built his empire through relentless drive. But this wasn't business anymore. This was personal. The lines had blurred between right and wrong, and in this game, there would be no rules. He wasn't going to stop until Dr. Hayes and everyone like him paid for what they had done to Ariana, and to the countless others whose names hadn't been spoken. He sat in a sleek conference room, surrounded by a team of private investigators, former law enforcement, and tech specialists, people who were accustomed to operating in the shadows. Malcolm had a singular focus now, bringing down the network that had protected Dr. Hayes. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. "All right, everyone. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I want results fast," Malcolm said, his voice low and commanding as he stood at the head of the table. He locked eyes with each person in the room, assessing their commitment. "We need information on the clinics Hayes works with, his contacts in government, and most importantly, the people who keep him in business. We're going after the head of this snake." Tessa Hall, his lawyer and now his closest ally, stood by the window, her arms folded. She had never been comfortable with the kind of work they were about to do, but she knew better than anyone how deep the rot went. Dr. Hayes wasn't just a predator in a white coat. He was a cog in a machine that stretched beyond medical malpractice and into the darkest corners of society. "Malcolm, I've been digging into the clinics Hayes works with," Tessa said, her voice tight. "And there's something strange. One of the doctors he worked with before starting his own practice, Dr. Evelyn Carter, was shut down last year under mysterious circumstances. There were no public reports, no records, just gone. That's highly irregular for someone with a clean record." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "So Hayes isn't the only one. There are others like him, right?" Tessa nodded. "More than you think, and they're all connected. There's a pattern here, Malcolm, but it's buried. They've covered their tracks well. I don't care about patterns. I care about making them pay." Malcolm's voice was full of resolve. "We're going to follow the money. If Hayes has been operating in the shadows for so long, then he's been getting paid off, and that leaves a trail. That's where we start." The team went to work immediately. Hours ticked by, and the room was filled with the sounds of typing and phone calls. Malcolm had the luxury of wealth, but more than that, he had the luxury of patience. And now, it was paying off. He knew Dr. Hayes wouldn't be able to hide forever. As the sun set, Tessa walked back into the room with a look of grim determination on her face. "Malcolm, I've got something. It's not much, but it's a lead. Dr. Hayes was involved in an off-the-books arrangement with a hospital chain in another city. It's not just the clinic. He's been working in the background, providing illicit medical services, procedures, prescriptions, treatments, all under the radar. The hospital has been laundering money through nonprofit foundations. This thing is huge." Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Where is this hospital? Who runs it?" "The hospital's called St. Michael's in Wilmington. As for the leadership, that's where things get complicated," Tessa replied, her voice steady but filled with unease. "The board members are connected to high-ranking individuals in both the political and law enforcement spheres. It's like a web of power, and Hayes is right in the middle of it." Malcolm gritted his teeth, a surge of anger rising within him. This was no longer just about Ariana. This was about the corruption that had poisoned an entire system, one that protected the guilty and silenced the innocent. "I want everything in that hospital, everything on St. Michael's, the board members, and anyone who's ever worked with them. No one gets left out." Tessa exchanged a quick look with her colleagues, who were already pulling up documents and making calls. Malcolm's mind was racing. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together, but there was still so much to uncover. Dr. Hayes might have thought he could intimidate Malcolm with his confidence, but he hadn't seen the force of a father's wrath. 2 days later, the investigation had reached a tipping point. Malcolm's team had compiled a wealth of information, each piece revealing a new layer of corruption that stretched far beyond the walls of Dr. Hayes' clinic. But just as they were about to strike, something unexpected happened. Malcolm was sitting in his office late at night, reviewing some of the latest findings, when his phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of his investigators. It was a single, chilling line. "Watch your back. Hayes knows you're coming for him." Malcolm's heart stopped. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. He had known this fight was dangerous, but seeing that message, hearing the warning so plainly, made the threat feel real. He immediately contacted Tessa, his fingers flying over the phone's keypad. We need to move fast. Hayes is onto us. He knows we're closing in. Tessa's voice crackled through the line. I'll get you the intel you need, but we have to be careful, Malcolm. This could turn ugly. I don't care. We're going after him, and we're going to hit him where it hurts. I want him to feel every second of fear he put my daughter through. Malcolm's determination had only grown since the beginning of this nightmare. He wasn't just fighting for Ariana anymore. He was fighting for every other person who had suffered because of men like Dr. Hayes. The gloves were coming off, and the world would know the truth. The next day, Malcolm's security team intercepted an alarming report. Dr. Hayes had fled the city. His office had been abandoned, his personal belongings gone. His bank accounts had been drained, and a few high-profile members of his medical network had vanished as well. Malcolm's first instinct was to hunt him down, to find Dr. Hayes and make him pay. But Tessa stopped him before he could take action. This isn't a random disappearance. This was planned, she warned. They're trying to cover their tracks before we can expose them. I'm not stopping, Malcolm shot back, his voice low but filled with venom. Not until he's destroyed. Malcolm's anger burned like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. His mind, sharp as ever, was focused entirely on one thing: finding Dr. Bradley Hayes. The clues were all pointing toward a network too big to be ignored, and every second that Hayes remained free felt like a personal betrayal. He couldn't let this slide. He had to act. Malcolm spent the next few days working with Tessa and his security team to trace any potential leads on Hayes' whereabouts. Despite his wealth, influence, and vast resources, Hayes had managed to cover his tracks with remarkable precision. The man was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Where the hell could he have gone? Malcolm growled, staring at the maps, financial reports, and phone logs spread out on the conference table. Tessa stood beside him, her eyes scanning through the documents. There's a private clinic in the Bahamas. It's one of the few places that could hide him. He's been linked to it through a number of discrete transactions over the last couple of years. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. That's where he is. Tessa shook her head. We don't know that for sure, but it's the only lead we've got, and we have to move quickly before he disappears again. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Then we go to the Bahamas. Get me a flight, and make sure everything's in place. I want Hayes brought in. As soon as they arrived in the Bahamas, the heat of the tropical air hit Malcolm with full force. His mind was already reeling with the possibilities. What kind of man would run a medical clinic while hiding from the law? And how deep did his connections go? Tessa met him at the airport with a grave expression on her face. I've been doing some more digging, she said, her voice low. This clinic is a front for something bigger. The people running it are part of a syndicate that's involved in high-profile trafficking and illegal organ harvesting. Hayes isn't just a corrupt doctor, he's a key player in this whole operation. Malcolm's blood ran cold. This was no longer just a battle for his daughter's safety. This was about stopping a ruthless organization that destroyed lives for profit. But he had already made his decision. There was no turning back now. The clinic was an unassuming building hidden in a quiet part of the island, surrounded by tall palm trees and a steel fence that seemed just a little too high. As they approached the entrance, Malcolm's security team was already setting up around the perimeter, watching for any signs of movement. Tessa looked at him with a mixture of caution and determination. We have to be careful here. If Hayes is inside, this will be a dangerous confrontation. These people don't take kindly to outsiders. I didn't come this far to back down, Malcolm said, his voice cold. We go in hard, no hesitation. If Hayes is here, we bring him to justice. The two of them made their way through the back entrance, a discreet passage that led into the building's service area. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The walls were sterile, clinical, but the flickering lights and the low hum of machinery made the place feel more like a holding pen than a hospital. Malcolm's eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every hallway. This was no ordinary medical facility. He could tell something was off the moment he stepped foot inside. Tessa led him toward a set of locked doors at the far end of the hallway. This is where they keep the records, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If we can get in there, we can prove Hayes' involvement with the syndicate. With a nod, Malcolm gestured for his team to stand by. The door was locked, but that didn't pose any obstacle for them. Within minutes, the door was open, and they were inside, surrounded by rows of file cabinets and medical records. Tessa quickly began scanning through the files, flipping through documents with a practiced hand. "Here it is," she said after a few moments. "This is where Hayes' name is listed, but it's not just him. There's a whole list of doctors, and some of them are tied to major hospitals in the US and Europe. They've been running illegal organ transplants under the guise of routine surgeries." "That son of a bitch," Malcolm muttered. "He's not getting away with this." But just as the team was preparing to leave, a sudden noise echoed through the building. Footsteps coming from down the hallway. Too fast, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Malcolm motioned for everyone to remain quiet. His instincts kicked in, and he signaled for them to hide behind some large equipment. It wasn't long before he saw a shadow pass by the hallway. A man in a suit, tall, confident, was walking briskly toward the records room. "Hayes," Malcolm whispered, recognizing the figure immediately. The doctor was closer than they'd realized. In a flash, the man entered the room, his eyes locking onto Malcolm's with a cold, calculating gaze. For a moment, there was no movement, just the intensity of the standoff between them. "So, you're the one causing all the trouble," Hayes said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "I've heard a lot about you, but you must know, this isn't a game you can win. You think you can just waltz in here and disrupt everything? No, it's too late for that." Malcolm didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered from Hayes's. "You've hurt enough people, Hayes, and you won't get away with it. I'll make sure of that." Dr. Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. "You think you can take me down? You think you have the power to stop me? You're just one man. You can't win against an empire." Malcolm's mind raced. Hayes had underestimated him. And as much as the situation felt tense, Malcolm could sense that there was a weakness. People like Hayes always had a fatal flaw. They got too comfortable, too sure of themselves. With a swift motion, Malcolm grabbed a nearby syringe from the counter and launched it toward Hayes, a move so quick that the doctor barely had time to react. "Not so untouchable now, are you?" Malcolm sneered. Hayes stumbled backward, eyes wide in shock, as he collapsed onto the floor. The syringe had hit its mark. Its contents were a carefully calculated move by Malcolm, the very same chemicals that could incapacitate someone without causing permanent harm. It was a calculated risk, but one that worked in his favor. Dr. Hayes lay unconscious on the cold clinic floor, the syringe's contents working quickly through his bloodstream. Malcolm stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't believe it had actually happened. He had his hands on the very man who had inflicted unspeakable harm on his daughter and countless others. The adrenaline rush was intense, but it was also tempered by a realization that this was just the first step. This moment wouldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Tessa quickly moved forward, kneeling beside Hayes, checking for vital signs. "He's out cold," she said, her voice steady but concerned. "But we need to act fast. This place isn't secure for much longer." Malcolm nodded, his eyes still fixed on the unconscious doctor. "I want him in a secure location, now. We're not done with him yet." Tessa pulled out her phone and quickly texted her team. "We've got him. Secure the extraction point." The operation was about to take a darker turn. Malcolm's team had already made preparations for an immediate extraction. Within minutes, two of his most trusted bodyguards arrived in a sleek black SUV, pulling into the clinic's back entrance. They weren't taking any chances, knowing that Hayes' network had spies everywhere. Every exit was covered, and with swift efficiency, they loaded the doctor into the vehicle. "We're not risking him waking up before we get him to the safe house," Malcolm said as he climbed into the car, his eyes still burning with fury. "Tessa, make sure no one is tracking us." "Already on it," Tessa replied, her fingers flying over her phone's screen as she activated an encrypted tracker. "I've blocked any surveillance cameras in the area. We're in the clear for now." As they drove through the winding streets of the Bahamas, Malcolm's mind raced. He had always been someone who moved quickly, calculating every step of the way. But this situation, this was different. Dr. Hayes wasn't just a doctor with a tarnished reputation. He was a man who had built an empire on the suffering of others, and now he was at the center of a conspiracy that reached far beyond medical malpractice. Malcolm's thoughts drifted to his daughter Ariana and the trauma she had endured. But now, as he looked at Hayes lying motionless beside him, he realized just how much bigger this fight had become. If he didn't act decisively, Hayes and his network would continue to exploit and harm people for years to come. They arrived at a secluded, heavily fortified property that Malcolm had secured months ago for situations just like this. It was a large, old mansion, surrounded by thick woods and miles of empty land. The perfect place to hide someone, or in this case, to break someone down and get answers. Malcolm and Tessa led Dr. Hayes to a small, windowless room deep in the house. The walls were cold concrete, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging overhead. It wasn't much, but it would do the job. As Hayes slowly regained consciousness, he groaned and blinked his eyes, disoriented. The effects of the sedative were wearing off, and soon he realized the gravity of the situation. His head snapped up, eyes wide, as he took in his surroundings. The fear was palpable, but there was something else in his eyes too. A coldness, a defiance. Malcolm stood in front of him, arms crossed, his expression as hard as steel. "Welcome back," he said with a smirk. "You're not in the Bahamas anymore, Doctor." Tessa stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Dr. Hayes. You've been running an illegal medical operation, trafficking in human lives, and destroying people for profit. You think you're going to get away with it? You're in over your head now." Hayes sneered, sitting up. "You think you can just waltz in here and expose me? I have connections everywhere. You don't know who you're dealing with. I've been untouchable for years. Your little vendetta won't change anything." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not untouchable anymore. You'll talk. And when you do, everyone you've ever worked with will burn, just like you." There was a long silence as Hayes stared at Malcolm, calculating his next move. He was a man used to power, to controlling the narrative. But in this room, the tables had turned. Malcolm wasn't going to let him off easy, no matter how many people he knew or how much money he had. "Tell me everything, Hayes," Tessa urged, her voice unwavering. "This is your last chance to come clean." Dr. Hayes' eyes flickered for a moment, as though he was considering his options. He was a man who had survived by outsmarting people, by silencing anyone who posed a threat. But as he looked at Malcolm, he realized that his usual tactics, intimidation, manipulation, weren't going to work. There was no easy way out this time. "I won't talk," he finally spat. "You think I'm afraid of you? You think I'm afraid of some billionaire? I'm a doctor. I'm a professional. I've helped people. What have you done, huh? All you've done is try to destroy me because of your little girl." Malcolm's expression remained cold, but his voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "You've destroyed more lives than you'll ever admit, and it's time for you to face the consequences." Malcolm's patience was wearing thin. He was tired of listening to Hayes' self-righteous ramblings. The only way to make him talk was to put pressure on him, something that Hayes couldn't buy his way out of. Tessa turned to the team in the other room. "Get the files, the ones that implicate Hayes in the trafficking syndicate. We need proof, something that will force his hand." As she walked out of the room, Malcolm leaned in closer to Dr. Hayes. "You've been given your chance to walk away from this clean, but you're about to lose everything. Your career, your wealth, your freedom. It's all gone. Now, you have one last chance. Tell me everything." For the first time since their confrontation began, Dr. Hayes' confident demeanor wavered. He looked at Malcolm, fear creeping into his eyes as the walls of his empire crumbled. But just as he was about to speak, the door to the room slammed open, and one of the team members stepped inside, a grim look on his face. "Malcolm, you need to see this. We've got something bigger than we thought." The air in the room had shifted. Malcolm stood still, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation as the door opened, and one of his operatives stepped inside, his face grim. "Malcolm," the man said in a low voice, "you need to see this." Malcolm didn't say a word. He simply followed the operative out of the room, Tessa close behind. The operative led them down a narrow corridor to another locked room, where a computer was already set up. displaying a series of encrypted files. The man tapped a few keys and the screen came alive with data. Malcolm and Tessa both leaned in, their eyes scanning the screen. "What is this?" Tessa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The operative pointed to a list of names, addresses, and coded references. "These are the people connected to Dr. Hayes' operation. High-profile individuals, medical professionals, and several figures in government. We've cracked part of the code, and it looks like Hayes isn't just a pawn. He's a central figure in a far-reaching syndicate. But what we've uncovered, it's bigger than we thought." Malcolm's gaze hardened as he examined the names. They were all connected to major institutions, and some even had ties to some of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the world. The organization wasn't just running illegal medical operations. They were entangled in a global web of corruption. Corruption that included politicians, CEOs, and even military figures. "This isn't just about people suffering on the operating table," Malcolm muttered, his voice ice cold. "This is about controlling lives, power, influence. They've been using medical procedures to manipulate people, to erase their pasts, and create new identities for the highest bidder." Tessa nodded slowly, her mind racing. "This could be the tip of the iceberg. If we expose this, it could bring down entire governments. Whole networks of power could collapse." But Malcolm's attention was still focused on the screen, his eyes narrowing as he made the connection. That's why Hayes is so valuable to them. He's their key. If we bring him down, we tear apart the whole system. As they processed the enormity of the information in front of them, a sudden realization hit Malcolm like a freight train. "Ariana," he murmured, almost to himself. He had been so focused on the revenge against Hayes, on taking down the man responsible for his daughter's suffering, that he had neglected to consider the full ramifications of what they were about to do. Exposing Hayes meant exposing everything and everyone involved. This was no longer just about a corrupt doctor. It was about a global conspiracy that could destroy the very foundation of the world as they knew it. Back in the room with Hayes, the doctor had begun to stir. The once confident smugness had melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but his will to survive was still strong. He had been in tight spots before, and he knew that his connections could get him out, or so he thought. Malcolm and Tessa re-entered the room, and this time the tension was palpable. The moment Hayes saw the look on their faces, he knew something had changed. The game had evolved. "You've uncovered more than you should have," Hayes said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can stop this? You think you can take me down and not suffer the consequences? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Malcolm remained silent, his jaw set with determination. Tessa was the first to speak. "We already know about the syndicate, Hayes. We know about your connections, about the people you've been working with. You're not just a doctor. You're a kingpin, and you will answer for everything." Hayes' eyes flickered with panic for the first time. He had always been one step ahead of his enemies. He had built his empire through manipulation, deceit, and an army of loyal allies. But this time, there was no escape. The walls were closing in. "You're done," Malcolm said flatly. "You can either cooperate and save what's left of your miserable life, or we can expose everything, and everyone." Tessa leaned in closer, her tone almost conversational. "The lives you've destroyed, the people you've hurt, the children you've turned into nothing more than commodities. You'll answer for all of it. The world will know who you really are." Malcolm wasn't going to waste any more time. "I've already made arrangements. Your associates, your network, every last one of them is going to come crashing down. If you want any chance of saving yourself, you need to talk. Now." Dr. Hayes stared at them, his mind racing. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once believed himself to be. The walls were closing in, and he knew that there was no way out. But then, in a sudden flash of realization, a plan began to form in his mind. "You want me to talk?" Hayes said, his voice suddenly calm. "Fine, but I want a deal. You can't just destroy everything I've built. You think you have the power to do that, But you don't. The people I'm involved with, they'll kill you. Your entire family will be wiped out. It's not just me you're going up against, it's them. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Who are they? Who is behind this? Hayes leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of cold indifference. You think you're in control, but you have no idea how deep this goes. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. The people behind this, powerful, influential, dangerous, they've been pulling the strings for decades. If you expose me, you'll be exposing them. And when you do, they'll come for you. They'll come for your daughter. Tessa's eyes widened in shock, but Malcolm's face remained unreadable. Who? He asked again, his voice dangerously calm. Name them. Dr. Hayes smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. That's the real game. You want revenge, but you'll never win. Not against them. Malcolm stood motionless, his mind racing. Dr. Hayes's words hung in the air like a threat, a promise that everything he and Tessa had worked for might be for nothing. The feeling of being trapped, of playing a game with rules that kept shifting, gnawed at him. But even as Hayes spoke, Malcolm's resolve hardened. The more Hayes tried to control the situation, the more it confirmed what he'd feared. This was no longer just about saving his daughter, Ariana. It was about survival. Who are they, Hayes? Tessa repeated, her voice firm, but there was a tremor in it, one Malcolm noticed. Was it fear, or just a recognition of the enormity of the situation they were facing? Dr. Hayes didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, deliberate breath as if enjoying the moment. You still don't get it, do you? You've played right into their hands. Your anger, your need for revenge. It's exactly what they want. They'll sit back, let you tear each other apart, and laugh as you do it. Malcolm took a step forward, his face hardening. Tell me who they are, right now, or I swear I'll make your worst nightmare look like paradise. Hayes looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his next words hanging in the balance. And then, almost casually, he said, the syndicate. People with more power, more influence than you could ever imagine. We're talking billionaires, politicians, military leaders, pharmaceutical tycoons. You've never heard their names. You'll never see their faces, but they control everything. Tessa's face went pale as she processed what Hayes was saying. You're telling us that they control governments, armies, everything? Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. Exactly. The syndicate uses people like me as pawns, but the real power is in their hands. They want control of everything: healthcare, politics, information. And you're not the first to try and take them down. Many have come before you, but none have succeeded. They'll just make you disappear. Your little operation will be crushed before you even realize it. Malcolm's jaw clenched as he processed Hayes's words. The true scale of what they were dealing with became painfully clear. It was no longer just about righting the wrongs done to Ariana. It was about taking down a system so embedded in the global power structure that it could never be defeated from the outside, not without sacrificing everything. You really think you're the only one who can play this game, Hayes? Malcolm growled, leaning in. You think that just because you've got these invisible puppet masters on your side, you're untouchable? For a split second, a flicker of doubt passed through Hayes's eyes. You don't understand, he said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of desperation. You're a small player in a world you don't even know. These people, they've eliminated entire families, destroyed entire companies. Do you think you'll be any different? Malcolm's hand clenched into a fist, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. They had no choice. They couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close to everything, finally bringing down the man who had hurt his precious daughter. Tessa stepped forward, voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. You're not in control here, Dr. Hayes. Not anymore. We will expose you, and we will make sure the world knows exactly what you've done. Hayes laughed, a cold, mocking sound. You really think the world will care? They'll forget you just like they've forgotten the rest of the people I've destroyed. You can't win. As Hayes's laughter echoed through the room, the door suddenly creaked open. Both Malcolm and Tessa turned, startled by the intrusion. A familiar figure stepped into the room, but it was not someone Malcolm had expected. Ariana. She stood at the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the harsh light. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and determination, but what shocked Malcolm more was the calmness in her expression. Despite everything, she wasn't crying. She wasn't broken. "Ariana?" Malcolm said, his voice laced with confusion and concern. "What are you doing here?" Tessa stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Ariana's shoulder, guiding her toward the center of the room. "Ariana, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." But Ariana shook her head, her gaze locked onto Dr. Hayes, who had gone still, his own eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. "I'm not afraid," Ariana said, her voice firm but soft. "I need to hear what he has to say." Malcolm's chest tightened, a rush of emotions overwhelming him. For the first time, his daughter wasn't the scared little girl he had protected all these years. She was a young woman, no longer willing to hide from the truth. But why had she come here, into the heart of this storm? Ariana turned to face Hayes, her eyes narrowing. "You ruined my life," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You don't get to hide behind your money and power. You're going to pay for what you've done." Hayes, caught off guard by Ariana's defiance, sneered. "You really think you can stop this? You think you're anything more than a tool? You don't even know what you're up against." Ariana's gaze was piercing as she stepped closer, her posture tall. "You don't know me, and you don't know what my father is capable of." For the first time, Hayes's expression faltered. He glanced at Malcolm, then back at Ariana, realizing that this confrontation wasn't going the way he had anticipated. The girl in front of him, the very one whose life he had nearly destroyed, was now standing in judgment. Malcolm glanced at Tessa, then back to Ariana, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and fear. Ariana had always been strong, stronger than he had realized, but this was different. This was a world he had shielded her from, a world where power wasn't just bought, it was wielded with ruthless precision. Was he ready to let her be part of this fight? "Ariana," Malcolm began, his voice soft but filled with uncertainty. "This world, it's not like anything you've known. You don't have to be involved in this. We'll handle it." But Ariana's response was unflinching. "No, Dad. This is my fight too. You can't protect me forever." Malcolm's heart broke as he realized the depth of her words. She was right. There was no turning back now. For a brief moment, the room was filled with silence. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. If they exposed Hayes, if they exposed the syndicate, there would be no going back. But this was the moment. The world was watching, and they couldn't back down. "Do what you need to do," Ariana said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We're in this together." The room felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was unbearable, as if the universe itself were waiting for the next move. Dr. Hayes's expression had shifted from his earlier arrogance to something resembling fear, but it was still masked by a veneer of confidence. Malcolm stood frozen for a moment, looking at his daughter. Her words, her courage, hit him harder than anything Hayes had said. She was no longer the little girl he'd shielded from the world. She was a force, someone who understood the stakes, who was ready to face them head-on. "Ariana," Malcolm said, his voice raw with emotion. He wanted to protect her, keep her safe, but he understood now. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about giving her the opportunity to fight, to reclaim her life. "I've failed you. I've tried to keep you out of this world, out of all the dangers that come with it." Ariana looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You didn't fail me, Dad. But I'm not going to stand by and let him get away with what he's done. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's ours." Malcolm felt the weight of her words, the raw power of her determination. She was right. This fight wasn't just his. It was theirs, and it had to end now. Turning back to Dr. Hayes, Malcolm's voice grew cold. "You've hurt enough people. You've taken too much from us. from so many others. You're not walking away from this. You're going to pay for what you've done." Hayes sneered, his eyes flashing with malice. "You really think you've won? Do you honestly believe you have the power to take me down? You're just two people, outmatched by forces you can't even comprehend." But this time, there was no fear in Malcolm's eyes. He knew something Hayes didn't. "You're right about one thing. You've been playing a game, but you never considered who was on the other side of the board, and you never considered the consequences of messing with the wrong people." The door to the room creaked open again, but this time it wasn't an operative or a surprise visit. The person stepping into the room was someone Malcolm hadn't expected. A face he hadn't seen in years. A man from his past, a shadow who had always operated in the background, but had now come to the forefront. It was Samuel King, a former ally turned enemy. A man who had ties to the same people Hayes thought he controlled. And now, Samuel was here, standing in front of them with a smug grin on his face. "I think we need to have a conversation," Samuel said, his voice calm, his gaze fixed on Malcolm. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Samuel King had been a name spoken in whispers during Malcolm's rise to power, a figure who had once been as ruthless as Hayes but had eventually disappeared. Rumors had circulated that he was out of the game, but the fact that he was standing there now, behind them all, meant one thing. He had been watching. He knew the stakes, and now, he was ready to make his move. "Samuel," Malcolm said, his voice tight with disbelief, "what the hell are you doing here?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he casually glanced over at Dr. Hayes, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like you've gotten yourself into some deep trouble, my friend. I tried to warn you, but you've always been too arrogant to listen." Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but Samuel cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save it. You're done." Malcolm turned to Samuel, his anger rising. "You don't get to walk in here like you own the place. You're not part of this." Samuel smiled, a dark, knowing smile. "You don't get to tell me where I stand anymore, Malcolm. The game has changed, and you've got a bigger problem than you think." Before Malcolm could react, a sharp, quick sound filled the room. A click, followed by a heavy thud. He froze, heart pounding, his mind racing as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Samuel wasn't just here to talk. He wasn't just here to make a deal. Samuel had a gun pointed directly at Dr. Hayes. Hayes's face drained of color as the barrel of the gun pressed against his forehead. "You've been playing both sides for too long, Hayes," Samuel said, his voice deadly calm. "You've betrayed too many people, and now it's time to pay the price. Not just to Malcolm, not just to Ariana, but to everyone you've ever wronged." Malcolm felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Samuel wasn't here to help them. He was here to take out the biggest threat in the room, Dr. Hayes. And as much as Malcolm hated Hayes for what he had done to Ariana, he couldn't shake the gut feeling that Samuel's arrival had changed everything. "I don't understand," Malcolm said, his voice a whisper of confusion and shock. "You were supposed to be out of the game. You were supposed to be done." Samuel's grin widened. "You thought I was out, huh? Well, I've been watching. I knew you'd get to this point eventually. I knew this whole thing would collapse. And now, I'm taking my piece." Before Malcolm could stop him, Samuel turned the gun slightly, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who had finally gotten what they wanted. He wasn't just here for Dr. Hayes. He was here for everything. "I've had enough of you," Samuel said coldly, his finger on the trigger, and he shot Dr. Hayes. His smirk returned, but this time it wasn't just smug, it was menacing. And just like that, Samuel King walked out of the room, leaving chaos in his wake. Every story connects us in a powerful way. Thank you for being here. For another heart-pounding tale, click the video to the left. And if you believe in the magic of storytelling, hit subscribe so we can explore more together. Until next time.